Hey, greetings, everybody, and thanks for this invitation to speak. My name is Daniel Pinchbeck. I'm the author of a number of books. My first book was called Breaking Open the Head, A Psychedelic Journey into the Heart of Contemporary Shamanism. And for that book, I visited cultures in the Amazon, and I went to Gabon to take iboga. I worked with ayahuasca in Ecuador and visited the Mazatec Indians in Mexico to take psilocybin mushrooms. Also wrote about the transformational festival world, Burning Man, and so on. My second book was 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which came out in 2007. And that book was looking at the prophecies of ancient cultures, indigenous cultures, ancient civilizations, who predicted that we were on the cusp of going through a massive transition or transformation as a species. So I looked at the classical Mayan civilization, the Mayan calendar, which charted out a 5,125-year cycle that ended in 2012, and looked at the Aztec ideas, which are very similar. The Hopi Indians in Arizona, who talk about the shift from the age of the fifth sun to the age of the sixth sun. The Nahuatl or Aztec culture. The Hopi culture talks about the fourth world entering the fifth world. The Nahuatl and Aztec culture talks about the age of the fifth sun and then transition to the age of the sixth sun. I also looked at the ancient Indian ideas of the yuga cycles, which are these vast cycles of time. Currently we're in what's called the Kali Yuga, which is the fourth and final cycle. It's kind of the Iron Age, where materialism predominates, where people have lost sacred connection and so on. And eventually it flips over back into what the Hindus call the Satya Yuga, or the Golden Age, and then progresses again through the Silver Age and the Bronze Age back to another Iron Age. But these are over huge cycles of time, and there's different interpretations over whether the Kali Yuga goes on for thousands of years more, or whether we're coming to the end of it. It's not clear. I also looked at the Judeo-Christian ideas around the apocalypse, a word that literally means unveiling or uncovering, the unveiling of the hidden thing, the revealing. So it doesn't just have destructive connotations. It also has creative connotations, liberational connotations, connotations of revelation and truth. The 2012 book came out in 2006, 2007. My first book, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002. And that book, I think, really helped jumpstart the psychedelic movement. At that point, I was a New Yorker. I've been working in magazines and in the media world in New York. You couldn't really speak about psychedelics seriously. They were considered a joke. They'd been really repressed since the 60s. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, all the psychedelics were classified as Schedule I substances. So you weren't even allowed to use them even in scientific research or medical research in the 70s. They were totally taboo. And but they'd gone underground, obviously. So you had amazing underground thinkers like Terence McKenna and Timothy Leary, who kind of continued the sort of legacy of psychedelic thought. But there was really no way you could look into them in the mainstream. So in that book, Breaking Open the Head, I really looked at the whole idea of the visionary experience as something that the modern world had suppressed, the kind of ways that plants can give you visionary experiences, the value of these experiences cross-culturally around the world. And so a lot of my work has been about this idea of initiation, personal initiation, planetary initiation. The next book that I published myself after the 2012 book was a number of years later, and that was called How Soon Is Now? From Personal Initiation to Planetary Transformation, also published as a handbook for global change. And in that book, I was thinking about the ecological crisis that we're facing as a species. It came out in 2017, and I'd actually, since the very beginning of my career, I've been very interested in global warming, climate change, species extinction, pollution, why these phenomena that humans were creating seem to be getting so far ahead outside of our control, and what were the reasons why we couldn't address them sensibly, considering how intelligent we are and how much technology we have and knowledge we have. It seemed very, very strange to me. So How Soon Is Now was an effort to kind of understand the situation. First of all, understand the level of the climate crisis that we're facing as a species, what that means for our future, and then think about what would be a solution path to a different social system that would be regenerative rather than destructive. And I looked at a lot of different types of thinkers and material. I looked at the great design scientist Buckminster Fuller, who had really realized a lot of this stuff in the 60s and had written a number of amazing books, including Utopia or Oblivion, arguing kind of like that was humanity's choice, that either we were going to create a world that worked beautifully for everybody, or ultimately we were going to drive ourselves to extinction. He also wrote a book called Operation Spaceship Earth, where he sort of developed this idea that we could think about the Earth itself as a giant spaceship, and humans are kind of meant to be the sort of crew of the spaceship. And we just kind of woke up on this incredible spaceship that had everything that we needed for life and to grow and to sustain ourselves. But the one thing that it's missing is a instruction manual. So so that's what we have to figure out. What is the instruction manual? So in that book, I looked at a lot of different areas. I looked at economics and technology and ecological sciences and energy and agriculture. The book kind of split up between three main areas to address. Basically, to think about what it would take for us to avert the likely consequences of ecological catastrophe. There's kind of three main areas that I looked at in the book. One is the technology, the technical infrastructure, which is areas like energy and agriculture and industry, waste management, and so on. The second are the social systems, economic and political systems, the nation-state governance system, the capitalist economic system, the debt-based monetary system. And the third area is consciousness, which is kind of what I put forth in the book is that, subjectivity on a mass scale is something that is produced, manufactured by media, by other forms of indoctrination. And it's a very clever structure because people are in their, when they become adults, they believe that they've, entitled to their beliefs and their opinions, but they don't really understand how much of what they think of as themselves or identify as their own kind of position have actually been kind of manufactured for them and produced for them by kind of a ruling class, elite media culture. So those three areas, the technical infrastructure, the social systems, and the area of consciousness and how it's produced through indoctrination, media, education systems. I looked at in How Soon Is Now at the different ways you could evolve those areas. And since How Soon Is Now, I've done some other books. Recently, I came out with a book called When Plants Dream, which is looking at the global phenomenon of ayahuasca and its spread around the world. And I wrote it with a young woman anthropologist, Sophia Rockland. That book is kind of an overview. We look at all that's known about the history of ayahuasca, which is in some ways not so much. Like we don't know how far back it goes and so on. I mean, for those who don't know, ayahuasca is a sacred plant medicine that's used across the Amazon basin by hundreds of indigenous groups. Generally, it consists of two plants that are brewed together for many hours. One of them is called Banisteriopsis caapi, or it's known as the ayahuasca vine. It's a thick, kind of ropey vine that grows on trees in this kind of coiled, almost like double helix pattern. And the other is a shrub, Psychotria viridis, that contains dimethyltryptamine or DMT. As we know, you could eat tons of DMT and would have no effect whatsoever because there are enzymes in your gut that recognize it and deactivate it. But you can also smoke DMT, and it's one of the most powerful psychedelic experiences. It can lead to totally losing contact with this reality, feeling that you're totally immersed in another dimension of reality. And in fact, there's two types of dimethyltryptamine. two main types, 5-MeO DMT and NN-DMT. And they actually both have very different effects when you smoke them in terms of the type of reality that you enter into. These other realities that are produced by smoking DMT have the strange quality of feeling somehow like more real than this one, almost like you're reaching a deeper dimension of reality. And it can be very much of a challenge to one's thought, to one's ontological framework, to have such a powerful experience. But yeah, so with When Plants Dream, Sophia and I looked at everything that's known about the history of ayahuasca, when the West began to first discover it, when the missionaries and colonialists came into contact with it, how they were really trying to sort of snuff out the shamanic culture and kind of drive it underground or destroy it. And yet ayahuasca found a way to perpetuate itself in the 1920s, kind of mestizos who were working in the Amazon as rubber tappers and as border guards, made friends with the local indigenous people and started to drink with them in ceremony and began to have these ayahuasca visions that came through kind of a Christian form because they'd been brought up Catholic. And this actually led to the birth of several new syncretic religions that blend together indigenous cosmologies with Christianity. And the two best known of those religions are Santo Daime and Unio de Vegetalis. The Santo Daime in particular has spread around the world, has chapters all over the place. Unio de Vegetalis is a little bit smaller and more private. We looked at all the research that's being done on the value of ayahuasca, and we also touched on other psychedelics. We know that there's a huge revolution happening in scientific research and science right now. We know that we're learning the capacity, for instance, of treating post-traumatic stress disorder with MDMA in psychotherapy with the assistance of therapists. MAPS is doing in the U.S. Extraordinary work on this. I think it's at phase 3 clinical trials with the FDA, and I believe they've had something like a 60% cure rate on veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars who've had treatment-averse forms of PTSD. And the benefits are so profound that the MDMA is being fast-tracked to be approved for treating PTSD, which a lot of the medications that veterans are given, don't seem to really help that much. So so you have MDMA, you have psilocybin being studied given to people with terminal illnesses to see how it affects end-of-life anxiety, and they're finding it really gives people a deep sense of serenity and connection, and kind of helps them with the transition. Using psilocybin to treat obsessive-compulsive disorder and cluster headaches, using ketamine to treat depression. Studies at the Imperial College in London on LSD and DMT, but they've been giving LSD to people and measuring, doing the whole measure of their brain waves and so on, and they're scanning the brain, and they're discovering that LSD really kind of like activates, and other psychedelics kind of activate all these different, usually dormant parts of the brain. And not only do they activate them, you can see them on these scans, but they also create new connections between them. And, this provides kind of support for the anecdotal evidence that psychedelics can be very valuable for creative thinking, creative problem solving. So that's all really, really exciting stuff. And ayahuasca has not been studied scientifically quite as much, I think mainly because it's harder to measure like super precise doses of it. But there is a lot of encouraging evidence. I mean, there were studies with ayahuasca for anorexia and bulimia, which is quite interesting because ayahuasca is itself kind of a purgative. I mean, for those who don't know, the experience of drinking ayahuasca can be quite difficult. You can often feel quite nauseous. You can often purge. Some people are scared of the purging, but actually many people find that it's a very powerful part of the process of working with the medicine, that it often feels like you're releasing stuff that you don't need anymore, not just physically, but also psychologically. And we believe that indigenous cultures would drink ayahuasca partially to get rid of parasites and other stuff that you pick up in the jungle. So it seems to have a lot of health benefits. And they call it the great medicine, of the Amazon basin. There's also, indications that ayahuasca is a very powerful tool for post-traumatic stress disorder. In fact, there's a wonderful new film, From Shock to Awe, which follows veterans from the Iraq War who work with ayahuasca, and they start out with very advanced forms of PTSD, very untreatable. And just after working with the medicine for a while, they're totally back to themselves. They're throwing away all the medicine in their medicine cabinets. So yeah, it really feels that we're just scratching the potential now, the surface potential of what these substances can do, and it's wonderful that society has somehow shifted to the point where it's allowing this renaissance to happen, and we're gaining more and more research benefits. And as we also talk about in When Plants Dream, the legal framework is also shifting. So, for instance, ayahuasca was kind of illegal in the U.S., but then the Unio de Vegetalis won a case on the Supreme Court level that protected their use of the medicine as a sacrament. Based on that, Santo Daime won a case. And basically now in the U.S., there doesn't seem to be much persecution for ayahuasca. Other places are different. Europe has still, I think, more persecution of it, but it seems like psychedelics are beginning to find their way through the legal framework, which could be of great value. So that's some of what we spoke about in When Plants Dream. And we also talked about, obviously, the spiritual and religious significance of ayahuasca. Many people who take it will find that their visions are kind of revelations that relate to their own ethnic, religious background, even if they're themselves not religious. If they're Indian, they may see Hindu deities. If they're Buddhists, they may feel a connection to the Buddhist pantheon. If they're Christians, they may connect with Christ or the Virgin Mary. For many people, who aren't religious, it gives them a sense of a genuine, numinous religiosity, like a direct experience of the divine. In fact, one idea that I spoke about in that book and other books comes from Tom Roberts, who wrote a wonderful book called The Psychedelic Future of the Mind. And one of his arguments in that book is that this psychedelic renaissance, he actually calls it the Second Reformation. For those who don't know or don't remember, the First Reformation was when Martin Luther translated the Bible, into German, and then it was translated across Europe into all the common languages that led to the Protestant Reformation. And essentially, before that happened, in the Middle Ages, only priests who read Latin had any access to the scriptures. So the Word of God was totally hidden and protected. And with the Reformation, suddenly everybody could access the Word of God. And this actually led to things like the English Civil War. Suddenly people read the book of Revelation and believed they were in that time of Revelation and began to seek to bring about, the New Jerusalem or the heaven and earth that was anticipated in the Bible. So the Second Reformation is, we no longer just can, read the Word of God for ourselves, according to Tom Roberts. With psychedelics, we can have that direct visionary experience for ourselves. And we can experience all the things that Moses or Muhammad talked about. I mean, I myself have written in the 2012 Return of Quetzalcoatl book about having a direct transmission of a prophetic voice that spoke in my head, that spoke through me while I was in the Amazon in Brazil back in 2003. And that basically correlated with the Mayan and the Aztec kind of predictions, that this would be a time of prophetic transformation, in some ways the end of one world and the beginning of another world, the next world. I wanted to, put all that into context and then maybe talk a little bit about the time that we're in now with this pandemic, and how, to me anyway, and to a number of the, groups and communities and people that I'm associated with, it feels like this is also somehow part of this prophetic shift or transformation of humanity. It's certainly taken a very unpredictable turn. There's so many things that are still very, very unknown about this virus, about how it's going to mutate, about whether a vaccine will ever exist for it, whether this shift in human society away from people being able to come together is going to be something that's semi-permanent, or And we know when we look at the history of diseases and viruses and pandemics, they actually have been very important evolutionary episodes in human civilization, and have created a lot of change and a lot of developments. So, and then with this pandemic, I mean, it's quite likely that this was a human concoction, that it was this kind of, unfortunate, dangerous biotechnology that was being kind of practiced at the virology lab in Wuhan, which may have released this Frankenstein from the lab. They were experimenting there with taking coronaviruses from bats and making them more communicable to humans by splicing them with other elements from HIV and so on. And in fact, there had been an outcry from a number of biologists and virologists a few years back that this was very, dangerous research. But it continued, and we don't know, maybe it was a natural thing that just happened, but it may very well have been released from the lab, and kind of indicates that we've kind of overstepped in how we're using our technologies, and the destructive kind of nature of a lot of our technological research at this point. But in any case, it's the genie is out of the bottle now, and we're in this period of change and transformation and uncertainty. You could really call it a state of liminality, a liminal zone. If you look at initiations around the world, there was Victor Turner was the anthropologist who coined this idea of liminality. And it's basically that part of an initiation where you're in this kind of ambiguous in-between zone, where you're maybe you're under the walkabout, or you've taken the peyote or the mushrooms or the datura, or you're in the dark retreat, and you don't really know what's to come, if there's ever going to be a return to the family, to the community, if your mind is going to break under the pressure, if everything is going to collapse. And it definitely feels like we're stepping into this liminal zone, but that's also a necessary stage in a process where there could be something beyond that, like a kind of gain of consciousness, a gain of maturity, a gain of awareness. I really like one recent piece of writing that I saw from the Rebel Wisdom guys, where they were talking about this as particularly seeming to be a feminine form of initiation, whereas it's not like the masculine hero's journey where you go out and you conquer and you push. That maybe we're exiting that phase of history, and we're entering something different. And the feminine initiation is more about going inward, connecting to the earth, connecting with seeds, connecting back to the land. And, really when we think about, what's happened, one thing that's quite amazing, I mean, ecological activists for many years have been kind of calling for a pause or a stop to industrial civilization, because we know when we look at what's happening to CO2 levels and mass extinctions and so on, we can't continue this way. We're going to drive ourselves to extinction, indeed, as we heat the biosphere and make it impossible for plankton to produce oxygen in the oceans, and forests burn down so that we don't have enough oxygen in the air, and the hydrological systems all change. So in a sense, the activists all kind of were yearning for a pause, for a reset, for a new opportunity. So in fact, we actually have that opportunity now. So in some ways, we have to welcome this. The question is, how do we make use of it? How could we construct, a new design for human society? I mean, we can see that there's kind of a battle right now between the authoritarian and totalitarian forces, and how they want to reorganize society around power and biocontrol and vaccinations, having direct technological surveillance on humanity. There may be other ways that we can reinvent civilization or society through local-based networks of community aid, mutual aid, through decentralized systems of exchange, local exchange clearing, credit clearing systems, time dollars. There may be ways that we can use this crisis to begin to both, spiritually, philosophically, but then also practically kind of transition from this old system, which we all knew couldn't really keep going. And it is quite fascinating right now to be in the circumstance where all of the non-essential parts of the economy have been shut down. And we're seeing that life goes on. People can't do their office jobs yet. So what? As long as food is being grown and water is available and energy is available, maybe this slowdown or the stoppage is going to continue for quite a while and lead to something new in terms of how we reconceive of society. And this is all stuff that I explored without knowing about the pandemic, but exploring it just simply as what would be that next social design in my book, How Soon Is Now, which of course I encourage you to read. Thank you very, very much for this time, and have a wonderful virtual festival.